We are taking you behind the scenes of the National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence.
With unprecedented access to the scientists pushing boundaries and shaping our future, this show will take you to the cutting edge and beyond.
And whether you're an expert yourself or just science curious, this is the show for you.
Welcome to the Turing Podcast.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Turing Podcast. Today we have a really interesting topic that has been on the news very much, and AI has been in the public eye like never before. This means that we need clear regulation and standards for all of the AI in general. So recently, the UK government released a white paper on AI regulations, and the EU has proposed a regulatory framework for AI, which will likely become law in autumn. So here today to talk about these topics, we have Eitel-Porter, who is Managing Director at Accenture and Global Lead for Responsible AI, helping organizations scale the use of data and AI responsibly and ethically. He's been a friend of the Turing, and Ray led the formation of the Accenture Alan Turing Institute's strategic partnership to create a channel for cutting-edge research in data science and AI into real-world applications, and also has chaired the government's data skills task force since 2015. And we also have Florian Ostmann, who is the head of AI governance and regulatory innovation within the Turing's public policy program. And his work focuses on regulation and non-regulatory governance mechanisms related to data and AI, as well as the use of data science and AI to facilitate the work of regulatory bodies. Recently, Florian has been heavily involved in the setup of the Turing's AI Standards Hub, which we will talk a little bit more later, which is a body set up to advance trustworthy and responsible AI with a focus on the role that standards can play as governance tools and innovation mechanisms. So I would like to say welcome to all of you and hello.
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 Yes, with me is Anneca.
Thank you, Bea. The first question is, what does the new proposed EU AI Act regulations encompass?
Thank you for that question. I think this is a really good starting point. At a high level, the European AI Act is a risk-based framework for the regulation of AI systems. It relies on different risk categories for AI systems. So there's a category of unacceptable risk levels. AI systems that fall into that category will be prohibited within the EU market. Then there's a category of what are considered to be high-risk AI systems or AI applications. Those systems will be subject to a specific list of what are called essential requirements, regulatory requirements. And then there will be sort of a remainder of systems that are considered lower risk, that are mainly meant to be governed through voluntary codes of conduct, with some special provisions for certain AI applications, such as deepfake generators, for example, where there will be a requirement that it's transparent when a deepfake is being generated by AI. So at a rough level, at a high level, that's how the Act is structured. It relies on these different risk tiers, and we can go into more detail on sort of what the requirements are. For high-risk systems, that's in a sense where the attention lies. It's high-risk systems and the requirements that those will be subject to. And for the implementation of the AI Act, standards will play a really important role, but that's a topic we can probably come back to in a bit.
And it's probably worth saying that the Act covers what I would call most of the typical areas of focus for AI ethics or responsible AI. So I'm thinking about topics like fairness, like explainability, accuracy, and so on. But it also provides a lot of structure around the processes that will be required by organizations to ensure that they are meeting the regulations and to be able to demonstrate that. So risk management systems, the documentation, and so forth. So it's not just high level. It does go into a lot of the sort of implementation framework that will be needed.
Oh, thank you so much for this introduction to the topic. So I have a further question, which is, but what is this that we're talking about? What is the standard and what does this entail?
So the EU AI Act follows the established European or EU approach to product safety regulation that has existed for quite a while. It's often referred to as it's known as the new legislative framework, and it's been used in many other product safety contexts. And that framework relies on what are known as harmonized standards. So those are standards that are developed by what are known as the European standards organizations. There are 3 bodies at the European level that are able to develop standards of that kind. Those are CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI. Those are their names. The way the process works is that the European Commission issues a request to those organizations to develop standards in support of a given regulation. So in this case, a request to develop standards that support the implementation of the AI Act. This request was issued earlier this year. It went to CEN-CENELEC in this case. So CEN-CENELEC has been charged with developing harmonized standards in support of the AI Act. This process is now started. So there's an AI committee in CEN-CENELEC that is starting to work to develop those standards. Once those standards have been developed, they will be reviewed by the European Commission. And if they're considered adequate, they will then be elevated to the status of harmonized standards, so they will be published in the relevant books of the European Union. And what that means is that once a standard is recognized as a harmonized standard, using that standard in the private sector, so if a company uses the standard, that creates a presumption of conformity with the regulation. So in other words, declaring that a company has complied with a standard or adhered to a standard creates a presumption that the product or the service, in this case the AI system, complies with the regulatory requirements. And so the burden of proving that that's not the case is on whoever wants to challenge that. So that's the status of harmonized standards in the EU. Those standards, it's very important to emphasize the standards aren't mandatory, so they remain voluntary. So in theory, it's open to any company to find other ways of proving that they have complied with the regulation. But in practice, it's the most efficient way of proving that, because it's an established process. There are there's a market of consultancy companies and third-party assurance providers that will be able to assess adherence to standards. And so, like in many other areas of product safety, it's expected that the use and reliance of these standards will be the mode of choice for companies to show compliance with the EU AI Act.
Thank you very much, Florian. What is the status of European standards in the UK? Will there be divergence from the EU Act, or will the UK adopt the same standards?
So I think that's a really interesting question, considering where we're at in terms of what's happening at the EU level and what is now happening in the UK with the recently published white paper. Because at the surface, we see the UK government taking a different approach to the EU Commission's approach, in the sense that there is no introduction of a new regulatory framework in the UK. Instead, there is an emphasis on relying on existing regulators to implement the principles that are set out in the white paper. But the similarity, or sort of the shared spirit that we see both in the EU and in the UK, is the emphasis on the role of standards. So again, in the EU, that role takes the form of harmonized standards. In the UK, we see a heavy emphasis in the white paper on non-regulatory tools, with standards being arguably the most prominent of those tools. So there's a strong vision for the UK to make prominent use of standards as a governance tool. Now the question is, what will those standards be? Interestingly, and unbeknownst to, I think, quite a few listeners out there potentially, the UK is still involved in the development of harmonized European standards, because those standards are developed by the European standards organizations, who aren't EU organizations. They're private bodies. So the UK has a voice in developing those standards. The standards that will be developed in support of the AI Act, in many ways, sort of thematically mirror a lot of the principles that are in the white paper in the UK. So, at the surface level, there is sort of a starting assumption, I think, to say, there might be a future where the same standards might be considered adequate for regulatory expectations in the UK and in the EU, because, in both cases, we're talking about the need for standards on transparency and for bias mitigation and so on. But of course, ultimately, it depends on, the details of those standards, what's the content of those standards, and what do those that make decisions about the use of standards think in both jurisdictions. So, I mean, in this case, ultimately, what do regulators in the UK, if they express preferences for standards, but also, individual companies, if standards adoption is voluntary, what do they consider adequate? Do they choose to sort of adhere to a European transparency standard for AI, or will we see an emergence of a standard that might differ in content, although it tries to address the same topic? But maybe Ray, you're much closer to sort of the logic of companies in making decisions about standards, so you might have things to add.
Yes, I think. Thank you, Florian. I think this is, in a sense, the big hope of companies. Frankly, is that standards will be used across borders, because I think it's fairly clear now that we're not going to see, similar regulations or legislation in different geographies. We've talked so far about the EU and the UK, but then we've also got the US and obviously many other markets as well. I think it's sadly, in a way, too much to hope that the legislative environments will be unified or somehow consistent. But if we could agree on common standards, maybe it's not all of them, but maybe it's quite a few of them, and sort of recognition of those common standards, that would go a long way to making life easier for companies in terms of being able to adhere to something which is clearly prescribed, because at the moment there's a lot of uncertainty around what it means to say you are being transparent or you are being fair or whatever. So if you have a clear definition of that and a way to demonstrate, and if that is recognized in different jurisdictions, that would be hugely helpful for companies.
So thank you so much for your answers. And we're talking about the regulations and standards from the top down. So my question now is, what are the challenges to actually implement these or have them adapted from the bottom up, from either the perspective of the companies or the perspective of the academic institutions?
So obviously, as we said, the biggest challenge at the moment is a lack of consistency, and the fact that companies are having to look across multiple jurisdictions and indeed multiple different types of regulation. So, we focused here specifically on the draft EU AI Act, for example, and the government's AI white paper, but then you have also regulations about data. You have many digital legislation, and then you have sectoral specific legislation in particular jurisdictions. And many of these things overlap. It's a bit of a Venn diagram where pieces of different legislation will overlap with others. And clearly legislators in a particular geography try to ensure consistency, but it's not always easy for companies to sort of see through that and be completely clear which pieces of legislation would apply to them or which standards would apply to them under what circumstance. But then in terms of the implementation within the company, I think there's probably two parts to that. One is you need to clearly define which guidance or which rules you are actually going to follow. So get a clear map of these ones are applicable to me because of the jurisdiction I'm in or because of the products I make or whatever it is. So these ones apply to me. Some may be legislation and some may be guidance that you choose to adopt. And then obviously the hardest part is then putting in place processes within the organization to make sure that people follow those. So these will be controls and detailed governance processes across the organization with appropriate training to back that up. Typically, in the case of AI, these will be embedded in what we call the model development lifecycle or the MLOps process. So as you're building AI models, you start by thinking about a use case, you then look for some data, then you clean and process the data, then you'll build a model. There are various stages to this, and you will ask different questions along that life cycle to make sure that you are complying with the guidelines or the legislation that you've chosen. But that's it's quite a big thing for an organization to implement, particularly if you're a large organization distributed over perhaps different geographies, different divisions, different products, etc. It's quite a heavy lift to get ready for this.
Perhaps just to add to a couple of those points that Ray just made. So I think the point about the landscape potentially being quite complex is a really important one in terms of, depending on the sector, quite a lot of different pieces of regulation and legislation that apply. And navigating that can already be a challenge for established companies, but it's a particular challenge for new entrants and for startups. And there's some prominent examples. If you think, for example, of medical devices, the medical device sector is a sector that's heavily regulated traditionally and has sector-specific regulation, and then, of course, all kinds of cross-sectoral regulation applying to it, like data protection legislation and so on. Now, it's an interesting field in the AI context because there isn't a very good general understanding in the public out there in terms of what a medical device is. And the fact that a chatbot, for example, depending on how it's used, be considered a medical device. And that's a point that might be completely, a startup founder might be quite unaware of, right? And so we might have similar situations in financial services where, a company that isn't a financial services company, but it operates in a different sector, in a data broker context, for example, enters a sector. And as a result, might sort of lack the awareness of just what are the many pieces of regulation that apply to it. So that complexity, I think, is a crucial point. And then maybe another point worth emphasizing is the potential vagueness in interpreting regulatory requirements. So in the UK in particular, we see, depending on the sector, quite a few regulators that traditionally take a principles-based approach to regulation. That means a regulatory approach that emphasizes certain general principles without necessarily specifying in every detail what that principle is meant to mean in any given context. So, for example, there's a principle of treating customers fairly in financial services without necessarily being set out in every detail, what that means when it comes to using machine learning for credit scoring. So where there is that vagueness in terms of regulatory sort of guidance, then there is sort of a question of regulatory uncertainty, and companies need to come up with their own judgment and interpretation of what the regulatory expectation is. Standards can play an important role, again, in adding that concreteness to some extent. And in the EU AI Act context, it will play that role because the EU AI Act requirements in the legal text are fairly general, and then it's expected that standards provide more detail. But then standards are a particular type of document of their own. And if a company isn't very familiar, hasn't used a standard in the past, that is, again, a challenge that requires a particular set of skills and knowledge around how standards are being used, how one might get certified against the standard. And it's that kind of capacity building and skills development that's part of the mission of the AI Standards Hub, which we might perhaps come back to later on, that we're trying to address with the AI Standards Hub.
So in a way, having standards or having something like standards would be trying to reduce the potential for loopholes, right? Because if something is very vague, people can just, in the wrong hands, can be exploited in a way, which is, I think, the biggest fear of the public, right? With all of this scare and all of this hype around AI is how it can be exploited. So I guess this type of regulatory research, in a way, being done is to prevent these loopholes, right?
Yeah, I think that's certainly one important part of it. I would say perhaps a bit more broadly, it's not just about loopholes, sort of the assumption that there is sort of ill intent in trying to avoid regulation. There's sort of a genuine challenge, even for well-intentioned actors, of interpreting regulation and understanding. And there are value judgments involved in terms of how to apply a fairness principle to a given context. So it's a challenge for well-intentioned actors, just as much as a matter of preventing ill-intended use of or avoidance of regulation.
I have a question. We talked about some of the challenges, but how do we set ourselves up for success here? Particularly, I know you mentioned startups or well-intended organizations. So wondering, how would they set themselves up for success?
So I think one of the key things is to consider all of these aspects, what we might generally call, responsible AI, from the design stage. So it's really hard if you develop a product or a service and then afterwards try to figure out, well, how should I have made it compatible with appropriate regulation and guidance, etc. Whereas if you set out with a responsible AI by design approach and you think about it from the very selection of the use case, is this something that's appropriate for AI? Do we want to use it in this context? And then as you go through data selection, model building, etc., all the way through those stages, that's where you have most flexibility to, change what you're doing, and therefore to make sure that you're going to be compliant with the least amount of effort. So I think that's the thing that organizations are kind of starting to get used to. And in a similar way, obviously, all of our readers and listeners will have noticed the fact that generative AI has exploded, recently. What we found is that organizations that already had a foundation in terms of governance processes and policies and things like this to manage how they use AI, those companies find it much easier to adapt when suddenly you have this new variant, if you like, of the technology that comes on the scene. Whereas companies that don't have a strong foundation, that don't have this approach of implementing by design, then find themselves suddenly having to try to catch up and figure out how we're going to cope with this new technology that we want to make use of because it has amazing potential, but we need to do so safely.
Thank you, Ray.
Maybe I'll just add a couple of points again. So I very much agree that implementation by design is absolutely crucial. And for an organization to start early to think about how to set up governance processes and documentation processes that later on make it easier to show compliance with expectations is absolutely key. To add to that, I think another area for companies to consider is to really be foresightful in being on the outlook on what regulatory developments and guidance type developments are coming their way, rather than waiting for a legislation to enter into effect, or similarly, rather than waiting for standards to be published, to actually actively follow the standards development landscape and get a head start sort of in thinking about, what standards are coming down the pipeline. Standards are typically published in draft form before they're published in their final version, which is usually sort of a 1-year period, where actors will be able to get a sense of what the likely content of a standard is and are able to prepare for the implementation. On top of that, of course, the ultimate objective, again, that we're trying to partly achieve through the AI Standards Hub is for organizations to actually become more actively involved in the development of standards. So rather than just being passive consumers of standards as they come down the line, there's a real opportunity. This is a live space at the moment, both in terms of the standards at the European level that we discussed earlier, as well as at the international level in ISO, IEC, IEEE. Some standards have been published, but the vast majority of standards for AI that will be decisive in the years to come are currently under development. And there's an opportunity, for anyone, any stakeholder, developers, private sector actors, as well as civil society regulators, to actively shape those standards. We know that that's not always easy, and there's sort of an important role for the Standards Hub to play to raise awareness of how to get engaged and how to make one's voice heard. So that's what we're trying to do. But we are seeing a lot of interest 6 months into the existence of the hub. So that gives us hope that that we're on the right track of increasing engagement in that space.
Now that you're bringing up the hub, can you tell us a little bit more about what is the hub and what is the mission and what it aims for?
Thank you. So the AI Standards Hub was launched in October last year. We just passed the initial 6 months of the hub's existence. It's rooted in the National AI Strategy, which was published, the UK government's National AI Strategy, which was published 2.5 years ago. And it's rooted in the recognition that standards will play a key role for AI governance for the reasons that we've already discussed: UK policy developments, European policy developments, international policy developments. So that's the first component, the rapidly growing importance of standards. Secondly, the fact that the landscape of standards development for AI is quite rapidly evolving and difficult to keep track of. So we, as part of the hub, going back to your question of what the hub is, we have built a website, and the key component of the website, by far not the only one, but the one that we are probably proudest of, is a database of AI standards that we've built. Standards under development as well as standards that have already been published. And that database currently contains over 300 standards already. And we're still at a fairly early stage of AI standardization. So it's very difficult already now for stakeholders to keep track of what standards are being developed and then to determine which standards are most relevant to them. If I'm a startup in sort of healthcare AI, what are the standards that I should be most concerned with? So we built this tool, this database, to make that easier. So importance of standards, the difficulty of navigating the landscape, and then recognizing that there are important capacity building needs in order to empower stakeholders both to use standards, but then again, going back to what I just mentioned, to become more actively involved in the development of standards. So there is an important training component for the hub, to the hub's mission, in order to provide the skills, provide the knowledge for stakeholders to both understand how the standards development process works, and then also to be equipped with the knowledge of best practice for AI that should be captured by a standard. So if I'm in a working group to develop a standard for bias mitigation, for example, what should that standard be saying? What is best practice for AI bias mitigation? So those are all things that we're trying to do with the hub. There's an important additional layer around international engagement and international cooperation, because standardization is inherently international in nature. So we're thinking about very hard and looking actively how we can collaborate with similar initiatives in other countries. And we have the website that we've developed that I'd like to invite everyone to take a look at. In addition, there's a program of events that is announced on the website. There is a program of research. We publish research outputs looking at gaps in the standards landscape, priority areas, and so on. So in a nutshell, that's what the AI Standards Hub is trying to do.
Thank you, Florian. And just a quick question. Sorry, what's the name of the website?
So the URL, the address
thank you, sorry.
is aistandards-hub.org.
Thank you.
Fairly simple.
Perfect.
That was also my question. I was about to jump in.
You can also follow us on Twitter under at AI Standards Hub.
That's usually the last question that we have,
Yeah.
but we have more questions, don't worry. So circling back a little bit, I want to ask something to Ray, if that's okay, because we were talking about, you mentioned how the standards come in draft versions and you have some time to look at them for companies. And Accenture has a lot of clients. You would be the people that would be looking at the drafts and preparing and helping their clients prepare. So could you tell us a little bit about how you're helping from the company side? What does it look like to you?
So we certainly engage both with the standards process and with regulatory consultations. I mean, a recent example was NIST in the United States that has done a lot of work around guidance, and they put out calls for consultation and feedback on draft proposals. We also very much encourage, our clients that we work with to get engaged in the process, but also, as Florian said, many of them possibly don't have the resources or the ability to do that, but you can obtain a lot of information, publicly and keep an eye on things. And if I draw a comparison with GDPR, which I think is quite encouraging, I think in the lead up to GDPR, we found that many organizations left it very late before they started to do anything to prepare for the legislation that was coming in. We think on average that companies now are probably reacting a year or so earlier in the life cycle, if you like, of legislative development than they were for GDPR. I think many still perhaps underestimate how much effort is going to be involved in getting ready for, let's say, the draft EU AI Act. It's very comprehensive in terms of what you have to put in place. We've, as Accenture, we've been on a journey now for several years already getting ready for it, putting in place policies, but lots of systems and training and things like this. And to Florian's point, which I think is very important, even though we don't know exactly what the legislation or the standards may look like, we have a pretty good idea of the direction that they're going in. And yes, you may have to make some tweaks along the way, but I don't think that there's any reason not to get started and put the foundations in place, and then it becomes much easier and quicker to make those final adjustments as things get clarified.
So we are talking about, and I think Florian mentioned that there's a push to try to get more input from also companies into these standards and these regulations. So my question is, what happens in the case that actually the things that are being implemented or enforced are actually not something that people agree with?
Well, I guess in the case of standards, as Florian mentioned, standards are not legally required. Standards are there to help organizations. So if as an organization you don't, for some reason, agree with the particular standard, you're perfectly at liberty to take a different approach to demonstrate that you comply with particular legislation. If it's legislation you don't agree with, well, then you're a bit stuck, right? Because that is once it moves into law, that is something that you have to follow. And at the end of the day, as we've seen, for example, through the evolution of the draft EU AI Act, it is a consensus building process, right? I mean, there's been plenty of disagreement amongst many different parties over the course of the development of the draft EU AI Act. You can't please everyone about everything. So you try to arrive at the best consensus. And that's what the groups that are leading standards development or legislation development are trying to do, while of course keeping an eye on what they think is right from a legislative and, most importantly, public safety perspective.
I think certainly generally, as Ray, you just mentioned, standards by and large are voluntary. There are some exceptions, maybe worth mentioning. So in principle, it's possible for regulators, both in the UK and in other jurisdictions, to directly reference standards. So we see that in some sectors. Of course, when that happens, then it affects the interest of a company much more directly. But by and large, I think, for the vast majority of AI standards, we expect that they will be voluntary. But I think, nonetheless, it's on the one hand, at the minimum, sort of a lost opportunity because of the potential benefits of standards to make signaling of best practice more efficient and so on. At the minimum, it's a lost opportunity if a standard doesn't match what companies think is good practice, or companies don't pursue standards. There's no uptake of standards. There are plenty of examples of standards that have been developed in various sectors that aren't being used much. So and without doubt that will happen to some AI standards. But whenever that happens, it's a lost opportunity. But the other important thing I think to recognize is the fact that standards are voluntary doesn't necessarily mean that a company that develops AI is sort of not faced with any pressures to adhere to a standard. It might be, for example, that the company's clients, if a company sells AI systems, have procurement rules that require the adherence to a given, to standard XYZ. And in fact, we see, that's something we see in many areas. And if that ends up being the case, a procurer saying, we'll only buy your AI service or product if you adhere to the standard, and it turns out that standard is very difficult to implement for a company because that AI developer's niche wasn't well represented in the development of the standard. That can be really tough and sort of have a serious impact on the business success of that.
I have a follow-up question. Ray mentioned GDPR in the back, and there were consequences to the not compliance with GDPR because it was a legislation. Do you see any of the AI standards that you were mentioning that have to be followed? Do you see any in the future consequences to not following some of these practices?
So we currently don't see any AI standards being developed that are required in a strict sense, in a legal or regulatory sense.
But do you think it's something that is in the future?
I think it's easy to imagine it emerging in certain areas. So in the medical device context, for example, there is a history of regulation to refer to standards explicitly. So I wouldn't be surprised if that happens for a standard for AI in medical devices, for example.
So it wouldn't be like as general as GDPR, for example, that affected several sectors. It would be specific to sectors then.
I think those are the cases that are more easiest to imagine.
I think the analogy with GDPR is probably closer to the EU AI Act itself, which will be cross-sector and will be the umbrella, if you like. And then the standards will slot underneath it and may be required in certain very specific areas. But I suspect more broadly, people will be required to follow the EU AI Act and then have to figure out how they're going to demonstrate that, and they may choose to rely upon standards as one way of documenting and proving. And I think it's also probably worth just mentioning that there can be a positive side to this. And you kind of signaled this, Florian, a little bit in terms of using, let's say, standards as a way of demonstrating to people that you comply, and then hence building trust. So if you think about also end consumers, you can imagine people saying, well, we comply with this particular standard as a way of giving reassurance to customers that, okay, it's okay to do business with these people for this particular product or service because we have some trust in the fact that the regulator put these standards in place, and therefore there's some independent view, if you like, that says that this is okay.
And so I think there's an interesting link here if we think about the sort of emerging AI assurance ecosystem, where we see sort of a growing sector of service providers that sort of provide third-party auditing or third-party forms of assurance of AI systems. At the moment, the way that landscape operates is that most of those providers develop their own frameworks because there's nothing else to work with. And it can, as a result, be quite difficult for their clients to compare services provided by different companies. And so that's the link here. One role that standards can play is make those kinds of services more comparable if they're used as a shared basis for how those kinds of auditing are being conducted.
It can be very helpful. Yes.
On the topic of trust, thinking about ChatGPT, it's very popular in the news currently. How would you say it fits in with the regulations?
So I think ChatGPT, of course, has been in the headlines for the last few months, both in sort of the public discourse and general media, and it's been a dominant topic in regulatory debates and expert discussions. I think it's a live issue to see how ChatGPT and similar technologies, generative AI more generally, will be tackled exactly in the EU AI Act. There's been some progress, and we now, I think, know that there will be, the AI Act won't be silent on generative AI. It looks like it won't be the case that, which was a proposal a while back, that all forms of generative AI will by definition be considered high risk. So the debate has moved away from that in a direction where there will probably be special provisions for generative AI. But it is a new development that, at least to many people playing a leading role in the policy debate, came as a bit of a surprise, maybe more of a surprise than it should have been, for anyone more closely following the technological development. And so it is a live question how the EU AI Act will address it. In the UK context, of course, with the white paper, we have a more flexible framework, which, the way the principles are set out, you can see how those principles might be applied. And I think there's a recognition in the white paper that, there are important novel issues that are raised by generative AI, for example, around intellectual property, when it comes to artwork, for example, that is used in the training of large language models or other generative systems. Yeah, so there's an important recognition that new issues are being raised. But I think, the answers in terms of how to address those issues from a governance perspective are yet to emerge. It also raises interesting questions for the standards context, because at least the way the field is currently evolving, for the foreseeable future, a large part, probably the majority of generative AI tools will be provided in the form of software as a service, rather than being developed in-house by the companies that use the systems. And so there's a challenge there, in a sense, to the traditional product mindset of regulation or safety assurance, in the sense that the company that provides the system, say OpenAI, has only limited control over what happens to the system, how the system is being used, what kind of continued training may be happening on the part of the company procuring and using the system. So there are interesting challenges both on the regulation side and in the standard side, because standards traditionally often focus on a product framework. There's a need for creative solutions in that space.
Maybe just a couple of other observations. So one is, I think it's fair to say that the very public advent of generative AI has also increased awareness for the possible need for regulation for AI in general. I think globally now there are more and more countries and individuals, senior politicians, regulators, etc., calling for regulation. So, that will, I think, accelerate the process of regulation and hence standards. The other thing is, I think that the Draft EU AI Act had already been doing quite a good job in kind of raising awareness of the possible need for regulation. Obviously, there's differences in opinions as to what kind of regulation is needed. But the fact that there is something in place and that was an advanced draft actually puts them in quite a good position to now add generative AI into it. They don't have to start from scratch. They have to make some modifications, but there's a framework, there's a vehicle there into which they can include new provisions relatively easily, which I think shows the value of, putting in place something that you can then build upon, even if it's not 100% perfect to start with, because the speed with which technology is evolving, we can't afford to spend 5 years every time we want to bring in a new piece of legislation. We have to be able to speed up the process to keep up with new technologies.
This is a great segue into the next question that I was going to ask, because technology is moving exponentially, right? Like we see how quickly it goes. So are there any mechanisms other than waiting and while it's a draft writing more, but for legislation that is already in place, are there mechanisms to adapt it to the new technology that keeps emerging?
Well, one thing that can help is having a slightly more principles-based approach to things rather than very specific rules. Now, companies often don't like that because it's harder to comply with a broader principle because you have less certainty as to whether you are complying. But on the other hand, I think it is probably more long-lasting in that you set the broad principles that you want people to think about and adhere to, and then the onus is on those complying to think about, in the current context, in the current technology environment and so forth, am I actually complying? Am I doing what the regulator really wanted? And then, importantly, documenting why they felt that they were complying. And I think often regulators look at that reasonably sympathetically. And if you've got a good reason for believing something and you document, etc., at least you show that you've tried to comply with the principle of the regulation. And I think that will help us to develop more robust legislation that will stand the longer test of time.
Thank you, Ray. Thinking about what you were saying about being more principle-based and the different approaches, one could say that the US is more rules-based. Are there benefits of having, say, principles-based versus rules-based?
So I think Ray put it quite well just now in terms of, setting out the contrast. Sort of the trade-off is to my mind, between the certainty that a rules-based approach provides to companies in terms of what's expected, at the potential cost of the rules coming out of date, the rules being misspecified, the same way in which we think about the challenges of defining the objective function of a AI system in a proper way that doesn't, protect against unintended consequences. You can easily set up a regulatory rule that's specified in a way that, leaves a loophole that the regulator hasn't considered. So rules, provide that certainty, which of course is often welcome to companies, may unlock some forms of adoption where otherwise companies might hesitate to adopt technology because they're hesitant in terms of being unsure of what the regulatory expectations are. So there's the certainty with the costs of potentially creating gaps or ending up with gaps, and the principles-based approach is that kind of broader approach. But of course, then comes with the risk of companies misinterpreting the principle and including in some cases where a rule would obviously have protected against a certain or accounted for a certain type of misbehavior, but the principle fails to specify it. So yeah, I think I don't know, Ray, whether you'd like to add to that.
I would completely agree. No, I think there are lots of trade-offs and often it comes back to more the philosophical kind of mindset of particular countries and regions that take slightly different approaches to regulation.
I think there's an interesting parallel in thinking about the role of rules in the regulatory space and thinking about the relationship between standards and regulation. So if you go back to the different scenarios that we considered earlier of standards being voluntary versus standards creating a presumption of conformity, for example, or in fact, regulators specifically endorsing a standard. You can think of standards as providing rules. So, generally standards will be more specific than regulatory, guidance. They may still be quite general. I mean, that's important to bear in mind. There are lots of process standards that can be fairly general, but, generally we'd expect them to be more concrete than what a regulator might publish. And so the question of whether a regulator should endorse a standard or whether legislation should give a standard that status of being a harmonized standard or a designated standard in the UK, may be thought of as reflecting that trade-off in terms of who takes on the burden of making sure that the rule is adequate. So is it on the company to judge whether a standard is adequate or not? And if it turns out the standard failed to account for a certain risk, the company is found to be in violation of regulatory requirements? Or is it on the regulator to say, these are the right standards? And if as long as a company adheres to the standards, the company is in the clear.
No, that's a very good question. No, I was just pondering on what you've just said there. So yeah, it's very interesting.
I guess our final question is where do we go from here? What's the next few steps for the Standards Hub and for your approaches at Accenture?
Well, I think we have taken comfort, if you like, from the fact that we published a survey last year of 850 larger companies globally. And they were indicating that they have set aside budget to focus on regulatory compliance and responsible AI specifically. So 80% said that they were setting aside 10% of their AI budget just for regulation, and nearly half of them were setting aside 20% of their budget. And I think that makes sense when you look at some of the other questions they answered, where they said 95% of companies do expect to be impacted by the EU AI regulations when they come out, because I don't think we've mentioned this, but the Act is extraterritorial in the sense that it applies to any company which is going to do business in Europe. You don't have to be a European-based company, but if you're doing business or selling products or services into Europe, like GDPR, you will be impacted. And actually, most companies were saying, in fact, only 6% of companies said that they felt they were ready in terms of having implemented their responsible AI principles and built a solid foundation. So a recognition that, yes, they're going to be impacted by regulation. No, they're not ready for it, but they are setting aside budget. And it's definitely a key priority for organizations at the moment, which I think is very encouraging.
For the AI Standards Hub, I think the important next steps are to think about the relationship between horizontal and vertical standardization needs. That's one important area that we are planning to focus on in the coming months. In the last 6 months, we have focused initially as part of the launch of the hub on horizontal standardization efforts. So there's a lot of work that we see across different standard development organizations on standards that are meant to apply across different use cases, across the use of AI in different sectors. But it's quite clear that a mature standards landscape for AI will consist of a combination between those kinds of horizontal standards and AI standards that are specifically meant to apply to the use of AI, say in healthcare or in financial services, or more narrowly, to particular use cases such as chatbot or a generative AI system, and so on. So in terms of expanding the hub's work, one important area is to think about engaging different communities across the different stakeholders groups that we mentioned in different vertical areas, enabling conversations around the relationship between horizontal governance approaches and vertical governance approaches. And that's, of course, reflected in many ways in what we see happening at the regulatory level. So in the UK white paper, the emphasis on sectoral regulators, which will raise that question of what is needed sectorally. In the EU AI Act, even though the Act is horizontal in nature, there will be a need to think about sector-specific provisions because different use cases will, going back to the risk scoring, will have different risk categories coming with them. So that relationship between vertical and horizontal is important. And we will be following very closely what's happening at the level of European standardization, thinking about the implications for the UK. And of course, the international level of standardization. So there are, in a sense, 3 levels of standards development. There's the national level, there's the European level, there's the international level. And part of what we're trying to do is to arrive at as coherent a landscape across these 3 levels as possible in the years to come.
So I had a quick question on that. As the resident layperson, I do have to ask, what do you mean by horizontal and vertical?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a very good question. It's sort of it's an established term in policy debates, but one that it is a technical term that I appreciate isn't familiar in wider circles. So what I generally mean, or what is generally meant by that contrast, is a horizontal piece of regulation or standardization is a piece that is trying to address the use of AI in different sectors, in different areas. So think of the Information Commissioner's Office as the data protection regulator. That's a regulatory body that we would refer to as a horizontal regulatory body because, it has a remit that applies to all companies, regardless on which sector they operate in. Any area where personal data is involved, regardless of whether it's healthcare or financial services, and so on. Similarly, you will get standards, that are meant to provide a risk management framework for AI systems at a fairly high level, regardless of the nature of the AI system. The vertical approach is an approach that either focus on a particular sector. So a vertical regulator would be the Financial Conduct Authority for financial services or other sector-specific regulators. In the case of standards, it can also be more narrowly use case-specific standards. So you might have a standard that's designed to apply to autonomous vehicles, right, which is sort of a particular use case within the broader sector of transport. Or in healthcare, you might get a standard specifically for cancer detection tools, right, which is a very particular use case. And so depending on the governance needs, of different that arise in different contexts, it's clear that sort of the landscape we'll end up with over the coming years is one that combines elements that are vertical in nature in order to address specific nuances that only exist in a particular context, and horizontal elements that are more cross-cutting.
Perfect. Thank you very much for clarifying.
Thank you so much, both of you, for all of your answers. I think this is super elucidating. I learned a lot today.
Same.
And I feel like that's the best from the podcast. So I want to thank you. I want to ask the final question. Florian already mentioned Twitter, but how can people find you and your work, in this case, the AI standards, and social media, websites, anything you want to shout out now?
So yeah, please take a look at the AI Standards Hub website, aistandards.hub.org. Sign up for our newsletter, which comes out every other week. That's where we announce events, new research coming out, and follow us on Twitter, AI Standards Hub.
And in my case, you can follow me on LinkedIn, Ray Eitel-Porter. And obviously, if you go to the Accenture.com website, we have a section there on responsible AI, which has a lot of useful resources and information.
Thank you so much. We want to particularly shout out the voiceless person that organized this podcast. So we want to say a shout out to Tony Zamaitis that made this podcast possible. And again, thank you, Anneca, for hosting with me. And thank you, our guest.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode. The show is hosted by me, Bea Costa-Gomez, Ed Calstreet, Joe Dungate, Christina Last, and Anneca York. Music for this podcast is produced by Jam and Sun. You can listen and follow via the link in the description or by searching Jam and Sun on Instagram.